Well, I think you've seen today that we've taken the issues from the corridors of power and negotiation and put them on the front page of effectively every daily newspaper in the country and their related websites to say very forcefully on behalf of the Australian public that there is a right to know what's going on in society, and we have been saying for a long time that that right is being eroded. And I think today you've seen we've turned the volume up very significantly on that demand on behalf of the voting and reading public of Australia.
And Campbell, that's a really good point. It's not about the media. This is about the public, isn't it? And the public's right to know.
That's right. I think it's convenient to say that this is journalists who are only motivated about getting their next scoop. But the fact of the matter is that it's journalism that tells the stories that directly touch the lives of people, and you can fall into the trap of thinking it's just about journalism until you think about actually if it's my life and something that touches me and my family or my community directly, then absolutely I have a right to know about it, and that right to know is carried out by journalists making inquiries.
I'm going to get a little bit nostalgic now, Campbell, but you think about some of the biggest stories that have occurred over the years that have come back to great journalism, dogged journalism, journalism with great perseverance and courage. We talk about Watergate. We talk about the Fitzgerald inquiry. We talk about the recent Banking Royal Commission, Aged Care Royal Commission. We talk about a whole range of subjects. Every day in every city around the world, there is great journalism that happens that helps people with their lives. Mm-hmm. Why is this such an important issue for the country?
Well, I think, as people say, and very prominent Queensland journalist Peter Grester, who spent time in an Egyptian jail, reminds us forcibly that when you have a free press, you can sometimes have a good and bad press. But when you don't have a free press, you only have bad press. And the fact of the matter is that democracy works because it allows for disagreement, it allows for people in authority to be made uncomfortable by stories that are told. And Peter, you pointed out those great stories that have been broken over the years, that have kept society on an even keel, have prevented laws from being broken, have stopped corruption. And I think at the point of every single one of those stories, as well as great journalism, there's a person or several people with enormous courage who have blown the whistle to say, stop, there's something going wrong about in our world. And it's those people who have the courage to put up their hand and say, I want to tell you something, there's something going wrong. And it's those people who are the core of the great journalism that then follows. And what we're really strongly asking for is that the federal government has to acknowledge and protect the rights of the people who have the courage to raise the alarm when things go wrong.
Tomorrow's newspapers, those front pages, I've never seen anything like it in all my time in journalism, Campbell, and I've got to say, it is a very powerful statement. Are the politicians listening?
Look, I think they are listening. As someone said in one of the hearings we've been in about this the other day, there's a difference between listening and hearing. We think they're listening. We want them to start really hearing and paying attention, and that this is not a thing that is simply confined to the recent raids of the newspaper journalist Annika Smethurst's home or the ABC newsroom. Those are the events that broke the camel's back. There has been a creeping culture of secrecy that's been invading Australian public life and Australia's, therefore, the public's right to know for several decades now. And the fact that you have media organisations that on any given day can barely agree what day it is, let alone come together in a campaign like this, combining to find a single voice, I would like to think that governments and all layers of government, from local government to the federal government, really start to think this might be quite serious now.
You mentioned that legislation that's been introduced over the past few decades that basically criminalises journalism in many respects. 60 different pieces of legislation. Campbell, I've never sort of really acknowledged just how punitive that is for us as media organisations, but done by stealth in many respects.
Well, done in lots of ways with good intention, in that really since the attacks of 9/11 and the terrorism that followed, there was absolute motivation and good motivation to keep nations safe. But it has been pointed out that no nation has introduced more legislation to counter that than Australia. And no nation has introduced legislation that, along the way of countering that threat to our society, has included so many steps to criminalise journalism. And repeatedly throughout that process, we raised our voices in every opportunity we had to say, wait, you know, you're impinging on the rights of journalists just doing their jobs, and now there's another set of criminal offences. We were repeatedly assured that real journalism was not the target of this legislation, but the proof is otherwise, and that's what we're asking for: a pause and a re-examination of that legislation, that body of legislation, and where it wrongly criminalises ordinary journalism, we think it needs to change.
You mentioned Annika Smethurst and the fact that her home was raided in Canberra. I was actually editing the Sunday Mail on the day that that particular story ran. I know how important it was. I know how she relied upon her sources and trusted her sources on that particular story. Are we really considering the contemplation of jailing journalists in this country? Are we going down the track of Egypt and Turkey and some of those other countries where they do jail journalists for just doing their job?
Well, the possibility of it happening is in the legislation. It's now middle of October. Annika and the ABC were raided in June. There's no indication one way or another whether they're still facing criminal investigations, whether they're facing jail, whether the investigations are ongoing. Imagine if that was your own personal circumstances and the police raided your house for 7 days many months ago, and still you're in the dark as to have you committed an offence? Do you face jail or not? We think it's an outrageous circumstance.
And I know the group, the advocacy group, the Right to Know group, have done research which shows that more than 80% of Australians support what the advocacy group is doing. How important is it that we get the right outcome in this, Campbell?
Look, I think it's one of those things that Australia is an incredible democracy, and people in Australia believe that it's an open and transparent country that really reflects the Australian personality, in that we have our opinions, we firmly believe we know what's going on, and we have a right to know what's going on. That's the kind of society that we think we live in. What our research has shown is that we actually don't live in that society. And when people discover that Australia, far from being an open democracy, is one of the most secretive democracies in the world, they're shocked by it, and government should be shocked by it as well. That's not the society that Australians want to live in. They want to live in an open place where the information that they should be able to access and learn about is available to them.
Campbell, what's a good outcome out of this? What do you see as a proper compromise from the government that sort of protects us from, the baddies that are out there that are trying to hurt us, but also ensures that journalists are able to do their job properly?
Yeah, I think there's one overarching thing that the world is contemplating now, is that we now know that real journalism, when it disappears from communities, causes a real harm to those communities. And the internet platforms do not replace real journalism. And at a time when we're all terribly concerned, and rightly concerned, about fake news and misinformation, governments should be doing everything they can to empower professional journalism and not impede it. So from our front pages today, we hope to send a signal to every layer of government, whether it's the smallest Shire Council in Queensland to the federal government, that the right of secrecy comes a long way behind the right of openness. And then at a specific level for the federal government, we're asking for the right to have a debate in a contested warrants system, to be able to argue before a judge whether or not, say, the raid on Annika Smethurst's house is justified or not. We're seeking exemption from the laws that have been passed that wrongly criminalise journalism. We're definitely seeking greater protection for public sector whistleblowers who have the courage to raise the alarm. And then from there on, it goes down to things like freedom of information legislation is obstructive and expensive and seems to us to be designed to impede the flow of information rather than enable it. The amount of documents in Australian society that can be stamped secret needs to be comprehensively renewed, and only the most sensitive documents should be stamped secret. And last of all, which is underway already, a comprehensive review of Australia's defamation laws. All of those things can happen and change the dial back towards freedom rather than secrecy.